Comenzaremos este foro internacional con la conferencia magistral de Pat Levitt sobre fundamentos científicos de la primera infancia, neurociencia y el impacto del ambiente. Te damos la bienvenida al escenario, Pat Levitt.
Pat Levitt, director científico, vicepresidente y director del Saban Research Institute, Mann en Neurogenética del Desarrollo del Children's Hospital Los Ángeles. El Dr. Levitt es un neurocientífico del desarrollo que realiza estudios de genes y entornos que contribuyen a la construcción de circuitos cognitivos, sociales y emocionales saludables y adaptativos. Los estudios de investigación clínica se centran en bebés, niños pequeños y sus cuidadores para descubrir medidas objetivas de riesgo de estrés tóxico. Levitt es miembro electo de la Academia Nacional de Medicina y forma parte de la Junta Directiva del Instituto de Medicina Regenerativa de California. Levitt se desempeña como codirector científico del Consejo Científico Nacional sobre el Desarrollo Infantil. Ha publicado más de 350 artículos científicos.
It's on? Okay, thank you. I'm going to start my clock so we're on time because I don't want to upset Dr. Torre. No, I don't want to upset you. So, thank you very much. I'm not sure how to follow what we just heard. It's beautiful, really. I've spent a lifetime as an adult studying development, and there's nothing more rewarding than to see the evolution of efforts across the world, and particularly here. You're doing something extremely special. I don't know of any other institute that has those four pillars that have been successful. I think Dr. Fisher, who you're going to hear from later, has a similar effort going on at Stanford University, but doing all four at the same time is really remarkable. Now, this is the third talk I've given in Monterrey. I gave one in Mexico City on early child development, and either you like what I have to say, or you're giving me a third opportunity to get it right. I'm not sure which one it is. So I start with this quote. There can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way it treats its children. Dr. Perez and I did not compare notes in using quotes. This one is, but I think they all say the same thing, that basically, without words, initiating this center speaks volumes in terms of the values that you have articulated without saying a word, because it is the case that our soul is really located in our children and what will occur in subsequent generations. So this is the message from economists, not from neuroscientists or psychologists. They use our data to draw these conclusions based on their own research. The healthy development of young children provides a strong foundation for healthy and competent adulthood, responsible citizenship, economic productivity, strong communities, and a just and fair society. So this is not neuroscience or psychology talking. These are economists who recognize that investing early really has lifespan implications, both in terms of quality of life, health, and education. And business people who are here know this quite well. So I am a neuroscientist, but I want to remind everybody that the brain is connected to the rest of the body. Sometimes neuroscientists forget that. And the reason I point this out is because early experiences have an impact on the entire child, not just the brain. The brain, of course, is my favorite organ. And so what occurs in the brain in terms of development has impacts on the rest of the child's development, health, and well-being. And we know that because of, again, what economists have shown, and I showed this at my last talk last February, just to reiterate that it's no accident that early adversity has an impact on what we view as adult onset diseases and disorders. This has been shown over and over again by economists. So if you want to solve this problem, just in terms of health, you have to start early, because waiting until, as much as I love cardiologists, Dr. Torre, waiting until adulthood rather than starting early to try to reduce and prevent the diseases that you try to repair is really, takes a lot of effort, much more challenging, more expensive. So I decided to give a talk that's a little different than what I normally do. I wanted to incorporate components that I participated in that turn out to be the 4 pillars that I have listed here in my own language, with Google Translate to the right. How good is it? Is it okay? Okay. I have 2 grandchildren who are completely fluent in Spanish. Their father is my son-in-law is from Mexico City, and I asked one of them to accompany me here to actually give this talk in Spanish, but they refused to come. They won't come. And so I'm going to touch upon each of these: research to practice, communication, training, education, and policy, all of which many of us who do science now recognize that in addition to research, we have a responsibility to communicate what we do, what we learn from research, and to educate and train service providers and the next generation of researchers to understand, take what we discover in our generation and utilize it to come up with brilliant new ideas and brilliant new approaches that are going to solve the problems that we were unable to solve. And of course, it's so important to translate what we do in terms of communication to policymakers who ultimately have the knowledge to understand how to make changes. Right? Neuroscientists, I'm not a policymaker, so I can't tell you what the right policy is. I can just tell you that early will matter a lot in terms of the policies that you introduce. Those are 4, we tend to categorize things, but those 4 are interrelated to each other. It's very challenging to separate them out. In fact, your center is not going to separate them out. It's going to integrate them in very innovative ways. So let's start with research. So children are really complicated. Pay attention to the cartoon up there, because it turns out by the age of 2, all these different functional domains. Has anybody been around a toddler? Yes, okay. So, you know, my favorite, of course, you can't see this. My favorite, of course, is the Elmo area, which starts at about the age of 18 months to 2 years of age. And then there's in the front, there's the phone call interruption ganglia. That's a real structure of the central nervous system that seems to occur starting around 18 months to 2 years. So children are complicated. The brain and body change dramatically over time. I look at my 5-year-old granddaughter, my youngest, and I've studied development for my entire career, and I'm still astounded by the rapid biological and behavioral changes that occur over this incredibly short period of time. Now, development is complicated, and I'm not going to go through this, but I just want to show you that, you know, above you see the events that occur to build, from a blueprint, from a genetic blueprint, the basic fundamental components of the brain. It starts early in the first trimester, so prenatal health matters a lot. And we know that that extends to different peripheral organs. The other parts of your body are already starting to come together and be built through a process called organogenesis in your first trimester. They're not really speaking well to each other at all. They're just spending all their energy trying to build the fundamental kidney, the fundamental liver. Of course, the heart is so important. And these occur, the blueprint is read out very, very early on, prenatally. And then you start to see integration in the second and third trimester, preparing that fetus for birth and what they're going to have to understand about their environment. And it's all to get them ready for their environment and the factors that are going to impact their development once they're born. So that includes the immune system, that includes all these parts of brain development, including nerve connections, which start about the third trimester. And in the first 3 years after birth, from the third trimester, about the first 3 years after birth, the baby is making about 1 million nerve connections a second. So this is audience participation. Snap your fingers, right? Millions, that's 1 million synapses, 1 million nerve connections a second, right? I did the calculation and I know it's correct, right? It's my advanced mathematics. So it's a remarkable process that is so complicated, and we're still just learning the fundamentals of how this child develops, starting very, very early on. And by the way, I'll share you all have my slides. You're going to share the slides. But after birth, we know that different functions take different amounts of time to develop. They start at different periods of time after birth, and they extend for different periods of time. So time matters a lot in development. In fact, the most important equation, mathematical equation you can think about in terms of what the center is going to be doing is recognizing that development is all about delta over t. That's change over time. And so something that occurs at 3 months and the same thing that occurs at 18 months may not have the same impact on the developing child because their status is different at 3 months than it is at 18 months. And we know, for example, that senses are among the first to really mature. Like, we already know that the auditory system is wired up prenatally. So a baby in the 3rd trimester and then after birth can actually distinguish and recognize familiar voices that they heard during the late stages of pregnancy. And I'll show you why senses are so important to have wired up from the very beginning, because if you think about your interaction with your environment, what do you use to figure out what's going on in your environment? You use your senses, right? And so a baby is wired up from the very beginning to be able to use their senses to learn about their world, particularly their social world, which is what I'm going to emphasize. And you can see up there different skill sets come on at different periods of time. Cognition, of course, is quite complicated, and that extends into the 3rd or sometimes the 4th decade of life, particularly things like executive function, which is an essential skill set that all business people want to have in their employees because it's about problem solving. It's about emotional regulation, inhibitory control, mental flexibility, being able to solve problems that are novel to them, and having an ability to remember facts that help them make rapid decisions. Now, these are called critical periods or sensitive periods of time. We used to think that they started at a certain point and closed off, and there was no chance to mediate or to modulate those functions after this period, after these windows close. But we know that's not the case. We know that it takes a lot more effort to make changes the later you wait, but there is still opportunity, particularly in cognitive domains where you can teach executive function skills. And Dr. Fisher has talked about that, actually. I'm not going to show the video today, but has talked about that it's just like going to the gym. That was your quote. You can exercise the skill sets that build executive function. Now, language starts pretty soon after birth, recognizing sounds, recognizing and starting to distinguish your auditory system, distinguishing sounds called phonemes that put them together that are called words, and then they learn that words are symbols, and symbols are related to objects, right? That's sort of the building blocks of language. That starts very early. There's a sensitive period of time where it's very easy to learn those skill sets in distinguishing sounds, and I see that in my own grandchildren who learned Spanish from the very beginning, right? So in the United States, I mentioned this last time I was here, I'm a product of the school system in the United States where I actually took Spanish, so I can say, Mira Maria, ahí está Jorge. Hola, Jorge, ¿cómo está? Hamburguesa y Coca-Cola. That's about it, right? It started in junior high school, in the United States. From a policy perspective, it's the biggest waste of money. I've said to educators and superintendents of school districts in the United States, it's the biggest waste of money. It's not a waste of money to learn a second language. That's very important. Second, third, fourth language. That's really important. But do it when the brain is ready to learn, right? Okay. And so we know this, that we have, what emphasizes is gene by environment by time component. Genes are not immutable. Genes are actually designed to respond to environmental experiences, right? About 99% of our genome we used to think about as, we used to call it genomic garbage. It turns out that the genomic garbage are actually all the regulatory parts of our genome. Only 1% of our genome encodes for the proteins that our cells use. 99% of it is about regulation, and it's about adaptation. And genes are adaptive in nature. That's what evolution is. They're adaptive. And so genes create differences in sensitivity to environmental experiences, differences in how one responds. That's the personalized or precision approach that we now are trying to use in different medical disciplines. But if they're not immutable, they interact with their environment. As you can see there, there's so many different factors in the environment that affect the developing brain. There are biological mediators that we know, the immune system, the microbiome in your gut, metabolic regulation, which I'll talk about a little bit. And these all impact, combined in an integrated way, outcomes.
You can think of child development as a scale that has two sides. A child's scale is placed in a community and has spaces on either side where experiences and environmental influences stack up over the course of development. One side gets stacked with negative factors like stress, violence, and neglect, while the other side gets loaded with positive factors like supportive relationships, skill-building opportunities, and community resources. In the same way that the weight on a teeter-totter affects the direction it tips, the factors that a child is exposed to affect how they turn out, the outcomes of their development. But the way the scale tips and the outcomes a child experiences are also a function of the position of the scale's fulcrum, which is like the genetic makeup of the child. The position of the fulcrum affects how the scale responds to factors that get stacked on either side and how easily it tips. We know that fulcrums start in different places for different children, and that this genetic starting point is an important factor in how a child responds to experiences and how they turn out. We also know that the position of the fulcrum isn't fixed. It's a sliding set point. Over time, the things that load and tip the scale can actually shift the position of the fulcrum. There are points in human development when this fulcrum is easier to shift. During these shiftable periods, our biology can be changed, making us more or less able to withstand negative weight that gets stacked on the scale. One of these shiftable periods is early childhood, and another is adolescence. That's why it's so important to make sure that children have positive experiences, especially early on, and to continue positive supports throughout development. By providing positive experiences during these sensitive periods of development and offloading negative weight, we can shift the fulcrum, making children more able to bear the weight of negative experiences later on, making them more resilient. So resilience isn't just about individual children. It's about the environments and experiences that get stacked on the resilience scale. Resilient societies are those that figure out how to stack more positives than negatives onto the children who will become workers and citizens.
So you'll see, I'll use the resilience scale. That's the resilience scale. That's a metaphor that's so powerful that everybody understands in terms of this balance between every child is going to experience negative some sort of negative experiences. We all do. That tunes our stress response system to be able to adapt and to manage. So it's not that we don't want children to experience stress or have negative experiences. Every human being has that. The question is, what is the balance between the negative and the positive? And I'll talk about why that resilience scale, for all that you're going to do in your center, is so important into education, training, and policy work. So these are all of the components that can impact. These are the environmental factors that can impact the development of a child, and it starts prenatally and certainly in the first 0 to 5, which is what the center is going to focus on. Incredibly powerful.
Learning is like the brain weaving skills into ropes. Each skill rope is made of many different smaller strands. A strong skill rope not only needs strong strands, but it also needs these strands to be woven tightly together. Each strand needs all the others, and no single strand can do all the work of the larger rope. When it comes to skills, you can't do one without the other. Learners need chances to develop all of their strands. They need to learn how to weave and reweave their skill ropes. And they need opportunities to practice using the resulting ropes. By weaving strong skill ropes, we can produce and maintain strong societies.
This is one of my favorite, that was one of my favorite very short videos, because it really emphasizes this idea that cognition, that learning, is separated out from what we used to call soft functions, soft, like social and emotional behavior, soft. I never understood that term in the first place, because I recognized as a child I had a lot of emotion to sort of deal with. It was like, it wasn't soft to me, it was made my life miserable, trying to figure out how to navigate. And so these are skills that develop. We learn about emotional regulation, we learn about our social world. So important, because learning, cognition, cognitive development is a social activity that's evolutionarily conserved. You can see it in songbirds when the male juvenile has to learn a mating song. It's not done independently by itself. It's learned from the adult male. Right? Language, the same thing. I can go on and on and on. So this is really, really important. And the social component, for me, is the beginning of weaving these skill ropes, right? So based on the concept that simple skills, I keep turning my head because I'm used to doing this when I teach. It's like, see up there? So I have to look down here. We don't have this when I give lectures in my courses. Based on the concept that simple skills beget more complex skills, and developmentally, simple circuits are built as foundations for more complex circuits and functions. I'm going to talk briefly about a component that we now understand from a lot of research, the hierarchical development of social behavior, where basic skills build more complex skills. And it's really based on a very fundamental concept about contingent learning, that is the association of a stimulus with a positive or negative component that you either learn and you build motivation to either approach it or withdraw from it. So approach of avoidance, and it's built on these contingent components that start very, very early. So in mammalian species, you can see the senses that I talked about, those are all on board at birth, all on board at birth. They're used to recognize and remember partners. Infants become face experts very, very quickly. Why? I'll show you in a minute why that is, because the stimulus, the visual stimuli, are associated with very positive outcomes for that infant, or sometimes negative outcomes for that infant. And the absence of those interactions, what we call neglect, severe neglect, is the most prominent early adversity that we know of worldwide. Not physical abuse, which is terrible, but neglect. That's 75 to 80%. And then we get responses. The infant is going to respond to the association of what they see, hear, smell, or the touch with some change in their physiology. So their infants are born, whether you're a mouse, there's a mouse up there, those are mouse pups, or a baby, a human baby. We're born physiological and relational needs. So the multisensory experience is shown here is in terms of feeding and tactile interactions, right? So milk consumption, thermotactile warming, all done through these sensory cues. What does it do? It changes the internal physiological state in a very positive way. So that's rewarding to that infant. So now they start to pay more attention systems to those stimuli, what they see, what they smell, what they hear, because the outcome is very positive for them. If the care is unpredictable or absent, the needs are unmet, and that's non-social sources of distress. So that's for mice, and this is for humans. The same thing. This issue around unpredictability is really important because contingent learning requires this repetitive same stimuli over and over again that feed the reward, the developing reward system. And that developing reward system is going to tune their attention system so that they start paying attention to the most salient components of their environment, which tend to be their caregivers and faces, and others who give them this physiological balance. So it all starts physiologically, biologically, right? So Liz Hammock, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time, is now at Florida State University in her own laboratory. She and I wrote this review in 2006 where we sort of thought about, well, how do we illustrate this hierarchy? So it's this internal physiological state that the infant is essentially very attuned to, and whether it's disrupted or whether it's calmed is the difference between motivation and reward in terms of the stimuli that they get. So the motivation system is, or circuits are built based on these early interactions, and then that tunes their attention. What am I going to pay attention to? Am I going to pay attention to Dr. Perez, or am I going to pay attention to Dr. Torre? I don't know, right? But rewarding interactions with Dr. Perez, I'd pay more attention to you than I would to you, or if it's the same, I'd have to figure out how to split my attention to both of you. And then finally, outward social behavior. So this is a hierarchy, and it builds motivation both in terms of detecting threat and detecting reward. Avoidance is moving away from threat. And here we go. And approach is moving towards positive interaction. So this all sets up through this social engagement that occurs so early that you're all going to study in this new center, because from that comes the other skill sets, including cognitive development, which is so important. If you think about it, motivation, reward, and attention are all part of cognitive processing. If you're not motivated to pay attention in math class, you're not going to learn math, right? And so contingent learning is so important early on. Okay. And this issue about predictability, which I'm not going to go into, is so important. And you'll see why. You'll hear a little bit from Dr. Fisher later, I think, about this. This is a graph from a paper that came out in 2021. It's not that complicated. If you look on the x-axis, it's unpredictable parent signals. So unpredictability goes off to the right, and the errors on a cognitive test go up on the y-axis. So you can see the more unpredictable the parental signals are, the worse the cognitive performance is. So unpredictability, or reverse of that, predictability is so important in the first 5 years, and we'll hear more about that. We'll hear more about that from him, that guy there, who has developed, based on this issue around predictability and based on this concept that social engagement is so critically important, and particularly early on in terms of building these skill sets of emotional regulation and cognition, the filming interaction to nurture development uses these neuroscience and psychology concepts to essentially develop a scalable intervention. So I'm going to just talk briefly about what we're doing to try to build upon this, to do a longitudinal study that has some scalable measures to it. How am I doing for time? I'm doing pretty well for time, I think. I'm okay. Okay. It's called the Family First Research Study. And it's done in Los Angeles at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which is, I think, the second or third largest children's hospital in the United States. I learned last week, I think I was telling Phil this, we have 700,000 booked visits a year. Even more than Texas Children's Hospital, although they brag that they're the best. Texas, it's Texas, that's exactly right. And so we do this study in Los Angeles. 14 million people in the county, 50% are Mexico or Central American, 50%. In Children's Hospital Los Angeles, 75% of the families that come for care are from Mexico or Central America, right? So 75%, it turns out that the families who are in our research study are Mexico or Central American origin. And so all of the RAs, and Dr. Perez met one of them last week on a Zoom, are Latino, Latina, bilingual. Most important beyond the language issues is they're culturally competent, right? So they understand and they work so well with families, and you'll see what the outcome of that is. So here's the study. This is an example of a longitudinal study where we see the babies at 6 months and 12 months, and now we're following up at 24 and 36 months. We have the standard questionnaires, lots of questionnaires that families like, they don't mind. In fact, every one of our families has never participated in research before, never. And it turns out to be an amazing experience for them in a very, very positive way. We do play-based behavioral assessments, dyadic interactions. We collect biosamples. I'll get to that in a minute. We do eye tracking, which is a wireless way of determining. You show a baby, an infant at 1 or 2 months will look at a video screen, and you can monitor where their eyes are looking as you change the scenes from social to non-social. Then you can figure out what's the most salient components of what they're actually looking at. And we do direct infant assessments to look at milestones, et cetera, and that's what we do. And the idea is to identify measures, particularly from the biosample perspective, a measure that we can utilize early on that raises the red flag that the child, the infant, may be having challenges, physiological challenges. And it could be due to a number of things. But right now, we don't have anything in pediatric practice that allows us to do that. We have ages and stages, we have some questionnaires, we do some very simple assessments for looking at very basic milestones, but they're not designed to identify children who may be experiencing toxic stress. And, there's your slide. We actually started now measuring heart rate variability. Why? Because heart rate variability, when posed with something novel, shows how the vagal system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system is regulating the sympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is so important in regulating stress response. And you can see up there on the upper left, the sensor is about this big. And we said, is a 6-month-old, if we just attach it, it's actually less adhesive than a Band-Aid. We put it on, and we do it during the play-based behavior, or maybe we do it during eye tracking. We've done both. And you put the sensor on, and it's wireless. So it records to your iPhone, and you get basically fundamental changes in heart rate. We do the same thing, by the way, in developing mice. Right. Now, we don't put a sensor on them. They're actually in a little arena that has pads in it where we can measure through their foot pads heart rate variability in mice. And by the way, the heart rate in mice is it's unbelievable. Yes. So we're measuring this as a proxy for vagal tone, which is so important in terms of stress response and adaptation. And you can get this data in very short periods of time. You don't need to send it home. You don't need to, or you could send it home. We do that as well. Okay, so this is where we are. I just wanted to point this out, not to brag or anything, because I have nothing to do with this. In fact, the research staff in my group tells me to stay away from the families. I might scare them. That was a little bit of a joke, come on. Thank you very much. Right. But it's true, I might scare them. So 210 dyads so far. We'll have, by the end of the year, we'll have over 300, 350 or so. 3 have left the study. 2 of the 3 because of work changes where they just didn't have any time to come in, and 1 moved. So nobody left the study because the study was overbearing or difficult for them to do. And we do lots of things, like we provide transportation, ride share, those sorts of things. And the most important thing is that we do developmental referrals for the baby if there are issues, and mental health and social support referrals for the babies if they endorse that there are problems or that we see for the mom, and these are moms, whether they're exhibiting depression. So this matters a lot to families, and they're so grateful for being able to talk to both the research staff as well as get help in contacting organizations, healthcare providers, and others who can really help them, because they're really at a loss for what to do. So these are the biosample collections. I point out the one on top. A buccal swab takes about 30 seconds to collect. There's enough DNA and RNA to sequence, and there's enough of material. We'd get it from the mom and from the baby. We get optional samples as well. The important thing there is that we're able to focus on metabolic changes that we think are the red flags for toxic stress. And that all starts with the organelle in your cells that creates energy called the mitochondrion, which is my favorite organelle. I fell in love with it in college, and the love affair has continued, because everything starts with changes. When you're stressed or when you're challenged, your energy, your metabolism has to change. That's the first thing that changes. And measuring that, we think, which is very inexpensive and very easy to do from a buccal swab, will give us insight into the relation between changes in mitochondrial DNA content, for example, and relations to development of the infant or the status of the caregiver. So that's our goal. And we've done these measures. I just show this because the range, in this case, mitochondrial DNA copy number, is very large, which tells us that there's not a single value that is the norm. We don't know what the norm is because no one's ever done this study before. And that range of high may relate, we hope, as we're doing our analysis now, to factors that may be indicating that the child is having a problem. And this issue around metabolism, Phil Fisher and I designed a study that we threatened to embark upon at some point in time, where we can actually use these measures of metabolism on mitochondria pre and post, before treatment and after treatment, in order to demonstrate that if they get a treatment and it improves them, we're going to see physiological improvement. We're going to see metabolic improvement, and we can measure that. So I just wanted to, I'm not finished yet, so don't applaud. I'm just thanking my research group, because they're the ones who do all the hard work. And I just take them to dinner. That's all I do. Okay, so I want to touch upon communication training and policy in my last few minutes. So in 2017, I wrote a paper called Beyond Hat and Hand: Science Advocacy as Foundation of Policy Decision. Most scientists in the United States go to Capitol Hill and ask for more money for research. And I spend my time going to talk to policymakers in states and other arenas about the importance of using science information to make policy decisions. I don't mention money at all, and that's what this paper is about. And it turns out that there are strategies. Nat Kendall Taylor is the president of Frameworks. He took over for Susan Bales. He's a cultural anthropologist. He's not a neuroscientist, but they understand how to communicate and what resonates. And there are the ingredients there. You can read this paper. It's relatively short. It's like 3 pages. And there are strategies for how to communicate science. And it turns out that it's really difficult to get scientists to pay attention to the skill set that allows that will resonate with non-scientists. That's a real sign, by the way, in New York City. It's outside of Rockefeller University. Yes, it's at a crosswalk, but I took the picture because it resonates, right? It's like scientists are just slow to listen to anybody else and say, you know, you're not doing it the right way, right? So, and here's the challenge. The challenge is that, you know, I'm a scientist. I say to you, you know, I give you, and you hear, I say A. Oh, of course, you just understood everything I said. And of course, you're like, you're trying to interpret it as like, I'm hearing B. They don't match up, right? And so that's really, really critical. And what do we do when we try to make the case? We meaning scientists. This is what we do. Oh, we'll give you more data. Here are all these graphs and charts. Oh, more and more data. There's never enough data for a scientist. More evidence. You need more evidence, right? And then, of course, you raise your hands and you have an epiphany. Now I understand, because you gave me all this data, that to me means nothing, by the way, right? And so that's the wrong approach that most scientists use. And so metaphors, right? The resilience scale is one example, penetrates because it provides, from real scientific data, concepts that really matter in terms of understanding this issue about, for example, positive and negative experiences. Experience early matter. That's what matters in terms of a policymaker making a decision that investing early in a program, and especially when it's really a strong program, matters a lot, right? And here is the other issue. We talked about this a little bit. People think in stories. We all tell stories. And I'm going to show you an example, and this is your take-home lesson. You have homework. You didn't tell them they were going to have homework, right? You have homework. So here I'm going to show you this. There's no sound. And your homework is, are you thinking about a story? It's just geometric shapes moving. But what's going on? The large triangle is really upset because he found out that the small triangle and the circle are having an affair. That's one story I heard. So you get the point, right? Let's stop there. You get the point that even for something that's not human, right? We anthropomorphize. We think in stories. This is a study that was done in 1944. It's a great study, I think. But I'm not a psychologist, so what do I know? It wouldn't get NIH funding today because it's too innovative. It's like, how silly is it? No one's going to know what's going on with those triangles and circles, et cetera. And now the big triangle's chasing the smaller triangle in the circle, right? Everybody in this room, I think, thought of what's going on with these three geometric shapes, right? And this is driving home the point that we think in stories. So when we talk about what's going on at the center, we have to tell a story about it. Really important, really important. A training and education, I want to give you this example from Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, where they took the brain story, and in fact what they did is they very cleverly, this is Nancy Maddox, held symposia where a number of us gave talks. And then she edited the talks down and created a curriculum called the Brain Story Curriculum, using the resilience scale as the core feature of the training program. This is a paper that came out. So she uses the resilience scale and created a course where you get certification. And this is the numbers in terms of signing up. There are 71 here in Mexico, apparently, that have signed up. But look at the numbers in Canada, 95,000. And look who's signing up. 6,000 in Alberta. These are all the healthcare services individuals who signed up, take the course, and get a certification. So now they really have fundamental understanding of why early matters so much. It's transformative, right? These are all of the nonprofits in Alberta. These are all the nonprofits in Alberta that took the brain brain certification course. So nonprofits, business leaders take this course, right? And it changed dramatically the policy of investing in educators, particularly early in terms of theory to practice, with getting brain story certification. And it transformed, in some cases, centers that are involved in treatment programs based on the fact that all those providers in those centers took the brain story and got certification to understand the fundamentals of early experience drives brain and child development, all of which your center is going to focus on. And then finally, policy. So this used to be my concluding slide. Invest early, reduce special needs populations. That's a fact, right? Early investment in high quality programs reduces the number of children who are in special needs classrooms. In California, in the United States. In California, it costs about $65,000 a year for a child in a special needs classroom. It could be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It could be externalizing, internalizing behavior. It could be all sorts of problems. They're in a special needs class. $65,000. For a child in a typical classroom, it's about $13,000. So there's an immediate impact, because a lot of policymakers say, well, I can't wait 30 years, right, to see the outcome. But there are early, immediate changes that occur with early investment. So it's a major increase in human capital via workforce. That's the economist talking. And of course, that's me talking. It's patriotic, and what you're doing here really is patriotic. So this is my own evolution in the policy world. I gave a talk in 1996 in Washington, D.C., and nobody said anything after I gave the talk. They were just being polite, I don't know. So I said, well, okay, I did okay. Then I gave a talk in Pittsburgh in 1997. The workshop was sponsored by Teresa Heinz, right? Of the Heinz family. Ketchup, right? Got it. And I gave my talk, 12 minutes on brain development. I sat down, and she turned to me and she said, nice try. Nice try. So, I was a chairman of a department, full professor, famous neuroscientist. Nice try. So I realized that I said A and they heard B, right? It was the right. I didn't understand it at the time. And through my interactions with a number of people, Jack Shankoff, Chuck Nelson, and others in this MacArthur Network on Early Brain and Child Development, and started the council through that. Jack Shankoff started the council through that, and his editors of Neurons to Neighborhoods. I became a storyteller, a core storyteller, and so those are all the places where I have been and spoken, sometimes multiple times. Sometimes it penetrates, and I've been to Mississippi 4 times, and nothing's changing there. So I tell stories, right? And using science, and telling stories about the importance of serve and return. That's the social, this is what we call early child development 1.0, about the negative impacts of poverty, maltreatment, depression, et cetera, et cetera. And now the story has gotten more complicated because we're connecting the brain to the rest of the body. And we have conditions and experience beyond caregiving that are built. So where you live, place matters a lot, whatever you're exposed to. Availability of green space, availability of nutritional food, all sorts of things have an impact on outcome in terms of child development. So all these things I talk about, not necessarily at the same time, but I just want to show you. So I gave a talk a few weeks ago in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was supposed to be, it was a talk on the neuroscience of social behavior. So I'm giving this talk, and it was on a stage in a hotel. And I'm looking down halfway through my talk, and I see this person by an easel, right? Her arm's moving. And I did time out, and I looked down, I said, what are you doing? And she goes, I'm drawing your talk. So while I was talking, the artist essentially drew everything that I talked about. And you can see that I talked about serve and return. I talked about simple skills are foundational. I talked about studies in mice and in songbirds. I talked about executive function. I talked about fish. I talked about positive and negative stress. I talked about the senses, all these things that I just talked about in a very short period of time that she drew. This was for service providers and policymakers who were in the audience, who really got a lot of science, but in the form of a story. The most miraculous part of this, of course, is trying to identify what's going on in the brain of somebody who can literally, at the same time I'm speaking, draw this out, right? It was pretty amazing. There are all sorts of brainless policies that we have. I'm not going to belabor this. You can get a copy, but you can read it. It is still a challenge. Okay. I would say the one thing up there, which I learned, oops, let me go back. I learned from Phil is that intervention where the focus is solely on the child, not going to work, because in the child's environment is a caregiver and a community, right, and neighbors, and all sorts of things are going to impact that child's development. So approaching intervention in a more holistic, integrated way really is the magic. And so I leave you with this, which you're not doing because this center is so unique from my perspective. If you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. You're not going to always get what you always got because you're changing the dynamic here. So congratulations, and thank you very much.
Gracias, Pat, por tu presentación. Damos la bienvenida a Phil Fisher y a Guillermo Torre a unirse al escenario para continuar con el conversatorio sobre neurociencia. Bienvenido, Phil, y bienvenido, Guillermo.
Primera Infancia de la Universidad de Stanford. El Dr. Philip Fisher es profesor distinguido de excelencia en aprendizaje en la Escuela de Graduados de Educación de la Universidad de Stanford y director del Centro de la Primera Infancia de Stanford. Su investigación se enfoca en el desarrollo y evaluación de intervenciones en la primera infancia en comunidades, así como en la traducción del conocimiento científico sobre el desarrollo saludable en condiciones adversas para su uso en políticas y programas sociales. Actualmente, es el investigador principal en el proyecto RAPID-EC en curso, una encuesta nacional sobre el bienestar de los hogares con niños pequeños durante la pandemia de COVID-19. El Dr. Fisher recibió el Premio de Ciencia Translacional de la Sociedad para la Investigación de Prevención en el 2012 y es miembro distinguido de la Sociedad Psicológica Estadounidense desde el 2019. Guillermo Torre, Rector de TecSalud y Vicepresidente de Investigación del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Médico cirujano por el Tecnológico de Monterrey, residencia en Medicina Interna, especialidad de Cardiología con tratamiento en trasplantes y entrenamiento en intervenciones en Baylor College of Medicine en Houston. Grado doctoral con la especialidad en Inmunología en la Universidad de Chicago. Ha sido profesor de medicina en el Departamento de Cardiología en Baylor College of Medicine y en la Escuela de Medicina Weill Cornell. Fue director del Servicio de Insuficiencia Cardíaca y Trasplante Cardíaco, así como miembro del Consejo de DeBakey Heart Center y fundador del Laboratorio de Transplantes, todos pertenecientes al Hospital Metodista en Houston. Miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 3. Actualmente, ejerce su práctica médica privada como cardiólogo intervencionista en TecSalud. Es rector de TecSalud y vicepresidente de investigación del Tecnológico de Monterrey.
¿Se oye? Perfecto. Phil, Spanish or English? English. Okay. Very good. English, Pat?
What do you think?
No, okay, very good.
I don't have my granddaughter here to translate for me.
So I guess we are going to have maybe a conversation between the three of us. So Phil and I are probably going to ask you questions, Pat, since you probably gave this plenary lecture. But maybe I want to start the conversation by maybe picking both of your brains on if we look at the same event years down the line, based on your both careers, experiences, research, the work that you've done in trying to transfer ideas and research into policy, what would you say would be a success of the creation of a center like ours here in Mexico? And you both deal with a lot of Hispanics and policy making in the US. I guess today is not that different from policy making here. Depends on what happens next year in the US and here, but I think we have similar problems. So maybe let's start by having a thought in what would be success over time in a center like this. And then later I maybe want, Phil, you and I pick on Pat's talks in a couple of areas that I think are of great interest, that are sort of of common interest for everybody here.
Well, let me, since Pat was talking a lot about storytelling, let me tell a little bit of a story that I think will help illustrate what success might look like. About 25 years ago, we, in my research group, were studying children in the child protection system in the US. And we got very interested. This was the first time we were trying to develop programs to support these young children in the child protection system. I got very interested in the underlying neuroscience and biology, and I started to meet people like Pat and a number of people that he mentioned who were very interested in biology and in brain science, but who were studying a very different group of children. They were studying children who came from orphanages, from institutional rearing in other countries. In the US, we thought mostly that children in child protection are there because of abuse, because their parents hurt them physically or sexually. When we started looking at the underlying biology of these children, in particular the stress hormone system, it turned out that these children looked remarkably similar to children who were coming out of these orphanages, where the care was very neglectful, where there was basically just one adult caring for very many children and not paying very much attention to the children. And that connection between the researchers helped us understand this issue of how important and how devastating neglect can be to children's development. We had thought in the US largely about abuse as being the most toxic experience that a child can experience, when what the science was beginning to show us was that unpredictable, non-responsive early care has a devastating effect on children's development. And that subsequently led, in the way that we began to translate that into information for policymakers about trying to reduce the amount of neglect and unpredictability in young children's lives, and the development of a variety of strategies which we could then test through evaluations to see if, by decreasing the amount of unpredictability and increasing the amount of responsive care, things would get better for children and families. And to me, that is a success story, because we started with science that was focused on a very specific topic and group of children. We started talking to other scientists who were studying other children and who had completely different disciplinary knowledge. I was a clinician who was trying to help improve well-being. And I was talking to these people who studied cells and neurons, things that I had not learned about as a graduate student. And when all of those pieces began to get put together, we developed ideas that ultimately changed how people thought about child protection, thought about issues like poverty, which is another big cause of why parents can be less responsive and have less predictability, and led to a variety of strategies that I think have, over time, shown positive impacts. That would never have happened had I just stayed in my own little area. So I think that process, if it can replicate in this center, in any number of different areas, it's not about child protection, it's not per se about any one of these individual experiences. It's about the way in which this knowledge ultimately can unfold in ways that have large-scale social impact across all different sectors.
Phil, let me pick on, maybe Pat, you can jump into, is the susceptibility for neglect or the toxic effects of neglect racially dependent, or is there a racial susceptibility that's determined by the environment, or is it genetic, or is it just so basic form of injury that it doesn't matter your background, your genetics, that you will have a negative, the same impact if you subject to neglect different species or different individuals from different races or of different socioeconomic backgrounds. I guess I'm trying to understand that, because that may become a very relevant question if we want to create a resilience scale for Mexicans in Mexico versus Hispanics in America, or so I don't know if I was able to really capture what the gist of my question.
So the first row gets infected with COVID. You all get infected with COVID at the same time, and one has sniffles, and one has major respiratory issues, and the other one has, long-term cardiac problems, and the other one doesn't even know that they have this, they don't have any symptoms, right? So that variability in terms of response to the same virus is essentially determined by genetic vulnerability, and that's ancestry. So race and ethnicity are social constructs. And ancestry is really the foundation of understanding differences in gene susceptibility. So anything that is extremely powerful, irrespective of susceptibility, is going to affect everybody. So severe neglect will affect everybody. But there's, excuse me, there's forms of neglect that we would not define as severe, but nonetheless impactful. And there you see differences in susceptibility. What's challenging about understanding what that really means is if there is an individual outside of the caregiver who happens to provide a social scaffold for that infant child, let's say there's parenting issues because they're working 3 jobs and they are just struggling in their lives, in their adult lives, but they happen to live in a place where there's a 5-star child care center with early childhood workers who took the brain course, right, and understand how to promote interactions and how to promote social well-being. That child may show less impact of the neglect that's happening in the home. It's a bit of a buffer. So are they less genetically susceptible, or do they have something else going on in their environment that maybe is buffering that? In the absence of that buffer, you may see very severe symptoms. But there's no doubt that genetics, from an ancestral perspective, plays a role in how somebody will respond. It's not inherent in that the genes are driving the resilience per se. People have been searching for resilience genes for 50 years. I don't even know what that means, right? I think what they're searching for is the adaptive physiology. How well are you able to adapt to stress? How can you create this balance so that homeostatically you feel great, right? Or you don't feel out of sorts. And those are the challenges in terms of differences in individuals who have different abilities to adapt. And we don't know if that's genetically driven or environmentally driven, because they're intertwined. It's quite complicated.
So, Phil, you talked about child abuse and compared child abuse to neglect. And it made me question whether what's worse, a negative toxic injury directly to, that's not neglect, you're paying attention, but you hurt somebody, versus neglect. Are they equal? I mean, they're both bad, I'm sure, but can you measure them in a scale? Which one of those 2 forms of injury is worse? Or it's an irrelevant question, both are bad?
Well, number one, I think it's a complicated question because sometimes in the lives of children, it's hard to disentangle the 2. That is, a child may experience both some physical harm and the absence of supportive care. And so unless you can understand separately how each of those contribute in the life of a human, it's hard to tease the two apart. Pat, I hope we'll talk about some of the research that's been done in the context of these animal models that can help us understand some of these things. I think one of the things that was most important in the story that I told before was that because the impact of abuse is so salient, it's so easy to see that if a child has a bruise or an injury that's caused by an adult, that we're going to know that that's going to produce some lasting harm. That we have tended socially to focus on that kind of experience and assume that that's the most prevalent kind of harm that children experience. And I think the research that I was talking about, one of the things that it really illuminated was the prevalence of non-responsive, unpredictable early care as a much more common experience for children to have than abuse. And so, for example, in the US child protection system, about 80% of children that are removed from care, from their parents' care, are removed because their parents aren't providing adequate care for them. It's not because the child has been physically harmed. And yet, we haven't developed until more recently a system for providing supports for children who've had those experiences and then will subsequently have difficulties with all of the developmental processes that Pat talked about. So I think it's helping people understand the prevalence of these experiences and the fact that it's not just the bad things that happen, but the absence of the expected, needed caregiving input that can create challenges, and that's much, much more common for children to have those experiences, and therefore we need to develop social programs to prevent those things. Do you want to talk about some of the animal research in this area?
Yeah, I would say that that the outcomes are not equivalent because they affect different developing circuits. So physical abuse threats, so there are some really illuminating studies that were done in rhesus monkeys at the Yerkes Primate Center. Mar Sanchez is the principal investigator. About 10% of rhesus monkey moms are abusive, physically abusive of their young. Not because of anything going on in the primate center, just because
that's just their nature.
10%, yeah. And it's very clear that that has a huge impact on these neuromodulators like serotonin and dopamine in terms of how those circuits develop. They're modulators of reward and motivation, and they're modulators of threat detection. So the threat detection circuits go on high alert of the offspring who experience physical abuse. That doesn't seem to be the case in neglect, where neglect typically is accompanied by unpredictability, as Phil said. That's really important because what happens there is issues around reward and anhedonia set in. So their reward system is not very well developed. They have this status of anhedonia where there's nothing very rewarding going on, and that changes their outlook in terms of how they engage and interact with their world. Their threat detection system doesn't seem to blow up like a basketball, right? In these offspring where there's real physical harm, the amygdala gets that's the part of your brain that is used for threat detection. It gets enormous, right? And so I think there are different outcomes based on the fact that the environment, the stimuli in the environment, one having little and very unpredictable stimuli, and the other having a lot of stimuli but very harmful, actually generates circuit development that is very different, that appears to last a lifetime.
So this is really interesting. So two mechanisms of injury will attack distinct areas of the brain.
Correct.
And you may be injuring one and the other may still be functioning very well and maybe overcome some of the defect in this area. So maybe my sense of this conversation and your talk is that when we looked at the centers, or I want to get some clarity, maybe for all of us, and in looking into what we'll do in the center over time. One strategy is to look at what's bad and how do you prevent injury from really causing harm, right? So you can center your attention in understanding what causes injury and try to minimize injury. Right? So that would be one way of addressing an improved childhood. The other one may be how do you build a positive environment so that if that happens, you're better prepared. It may not be necessarily the same. So maybe can both of you share with us what are the things that the center, your center will do to promote a better environment so that maybe the epigenetic transformation will get these genes that are very protective and your mitochondria will be more resilient. And
That's you notice that it's called the resilience scale, not the toxic stress scale, right? Toxic stress scale would be, all these negative things pounding down on one side of the weight of the balance. To me, it's all about understanding the factors that are going to promote the ability to be adaptive. There's some of our closest friends, like Nathan Fox, hates the word resilience. He likes the word adaptation, because that's really what we're talking about, being able to adapt to challenging situations. If you build that skill, then you don't have to spend your entire focus worrying about all the different factors that can have a negative impact. Rather, you want to avoid some of those things, right? But the center is not going to be able to do that, right? The center could figure out how to implement things that promote resilience, which is what Phil works on. And in my own story, my own experience of understanding my resilience, because I grew up with a developmental disability, a severe speech impediment, I had a very close relationship with my brother, who also stuttered, by the way, and really created the social scaffold for me to deal with all the stuff that happened when I was at school, because my family couldn't prevent kids teasing me or getting into fights, which I did often, by the way. I know that surprises you. Right? As a little kid. It surprises
me that you stutter. It doesn't. You must have overcome that very well.
This is exhibit A of why research and interventions work, because when I started, I had to go see a school psychologist who kept insisting that I hated my mother, which is why I stuttered. Seriously. And those who in the audience who are old enough to know this, that was the theme. That was like, and everything about the intervention was built around getting me not to hate my mother. And I said, you know, when I come home from school, I have a piece of cherry pie. How can I hate her, right? And a glass of milk. And then it became obvious from research that it's actually a motor circuit, an auditory motor problem of synchronization that causes the impediments that occur. That changed completely. So I got early intervention. My brother didn't. He's 5 years older than me, and he still stutters. And my father also stutters. You'd think there's something genetics there? Yeah. So the research turned into a very different intervention based on understanding, right, that it wasn't this psychological construct. It was really about a physiological change. To me, I think figuring out how you build resilience through the activities of the center, and some of that is policy changes that have to take place. In some of the states where I've given talks, they didn't have an assessment system for quality early child care. They didn't have a rating system. So parents were in the dark about, well, where are we going to, you know, and there were regions of urban areas that had no child care whatsoever, zero, which means if they wanted child care, they'd have to get on a bus for an hour and a half and bring their child to a child care center, and they didn't even know whether it was a good one or not a good one. The good ones, based on the number of educators, whether they have a high school diploma or not, those are the sorts of things. And it changed completely based on the story about early childhood being so meaningful. The policy change was rating the daycare centers, improving the quality of the educators who are working in those daycare centers. They're not babysitters, right? They're actually part of creating the social scaffold that creates resilience for that population. And so even though they were from poor families, not a lot of resources, their abilities, their cognitive development, et cetera, improved dramatically. And Art Rolnick, who's an economist at the University of Minnesota, started a program like this where in Minneapolis and St. Paul, there were parts of that city that had no care at all and no rating system. He got Target, Best Buy, other companies invested in this pilot program that he ran. So businesses invested in this, so important. And it was transformative in terms of outcomes, even though the children were still in situations in which were not ideal, but they had great childcare.
So what kind of evidence do we have? Do you have evidence that they have better performance in elementary school, or
Yes.
or
Standardized
biological,
testing.
or just standardized testing?
Ready to read, when they start kindergarten, numbers went up dramatically. Cognitive testing in the third grade went up dramatically for those kids. Really major changes. Not surprising.
No, I understand. No, I just wanted to see
Yeah.
the level of evidence, right? So it meant you eventually would like to see a biological marker that will help you identify earlier. I guess that's
That's
part
what
of
we're
your
trying to
work,
do.
right? So
Yes.
something really objective.
Yeah, we
That's
have
not soft.
two objectives. One is identify something that is a red flag, not necessarily like they have to go see a pediatrician because they're ill, but there's a red flag. Things are going on, and their stress response system is disrupted, something like that. The other is in my learning about what Phil does. I'm not a clinician. I'm not an interventionist. I wasn't trained. So for me, working with somebody who can think very critically about how to design an intervention study and look for biological markers that indicate problems pre-treatment and then determining efficacy post-treatment, that to me is the magic, and something that this center, in my opinion, my prediction is that your center is going to be doing some studies like that. And as well, as we discussed, longitudinal studies, which are so critically important to collect large amounts of data to get a sense from a population level of the kinds of things that you can do early.
Yeah, I just want to really emphasize in terms of forecasting the future of this center that one of the best things that can happen is simply to bring people with very different knowledge bases together. Sometimes it's like oil and water. People only want to stay in their space, yeah, like that. And so I'll give you an example of that. When I arrived at an institution, not Stanford, but where I was before, there were some cognitive scientists who were studying this concept of working memory. Really interesting. So you get then they had developed a computer task to measure working memory. How many different things can you hold in your brain at the same time? And so they would flash these images on a screen, and they had little like the movie Pat showed, little shapes that were different colors, and you had to say how many of them changed from one brief second where they showed it to the next one. And as the task went on, more and more of these different shapes came on the screen. So it got harder and harder. I have terrible working memory. I can hold about 2 of these in my mind at the same time. But again, in the work that we do with children from high early stress backgrounds, this was fascinating to me because one of the things we see when these children enter school is that they have a very hard time remembering what they're supposed to do. So if a teacher walks them through, you're supposed to raise your hand before you say something, or you're supposed to share toys, they can remember it, but they forget almost right away when they've learned these things, and that creates a lot of difficulties. I was so interested in what these researchers were doing, and I said, well, can we do this with kids? Can we do it with kids? Because their whole research was based around college students, because they could get lots of people in. They had absolutely no interest in children or in children with early life stress background. So they didn't end up being they wouldn't have belonged in your center. But on the other hand, what Pat's saying, when I first started to interact with these brilliant neuroscientists, I was very intimidated because they know things about cells and about neurons and about neural circuits that, again, that I had no idea about. But a few conversations in, I learned that they were equally intimidated by the fact that we actually do things where we try to change people's behavior and then measure through clinical trials whether anything has happened. The idea of like actually talking to parents and trying to get them to act differently towards their children was as intimidating, not to Pat, but to some of the other neuroscientists as the neuroscience was to me. And I think the fact that we were interested and wanted to bridge that gap was really, really important. The other thing I wanted to add, and I'll talk some more about this later, is that I think the other thing that we've learned over time is that you have to have the end users, or the people who are going to be the recipients, in communities, in families, in schools, equally involved. It's great to have a center where you have a neuroscientist talking to a psychologist, talking to an occupational therapist. But if you don't have a family telling you what kind of supports would be most useful for them, if you don't know what's going to work in a preschool, you'll design things that may or may not fit. And so I think one of the big lessons of all of the evidence-based programs that have developed, at least in the US, is that they may show good results when evaluated in carefully controlled studies, but then when they try to scale, they really fail, because they were never designed for those for whom they're intended, and there was never input from that group of people as well. So I think this center needs to be outward-facing and really have sort of a lot of permeability into the communities, into the lives of people that you're hoping to help, in addition to trying to bridge all of the science that can happen at a place like Tec de Monterrey.
You know, every study that we do, we have a community advisory board. Every study. So the studies that I talked about, we have a community advisory board. That's different from the hospital has a community advisory board. But for research studies now, it's so critically important, because I say to people in my research group, I said, take what we're doing seriously, but don't take yourself so seriously. Recognize, right, that you're working with families that have, you know, significant challenges, that they're nervous about even participating in research for the first time, and they're here to try to help, right? Not just themselves, but they understand that when they participate in research, it has a broader, it has a broader impact. So be intense about what you're doing, right? I don't need to lecture on this, because all of you, every one of you that I've met, very intense, and that's good. But you know, you take the center seriously, and your goals and the mission that you have seriously, and be really rigorous, which you all are, about what you're doing. But recognize that that can be separated from having some self-awareness that you're not the center of the universe individually.
Sure. I think that's a very important message, the community engagement.
Yes.
And maybe not to think about yourself so seriously. I think that I like that a lot. I think doctors make a very bad example of that, I think. It's another confession. I confessed twice today. So I want to ask both of you a question of my ignorance. You know, when I was in med school many, many years ago, people talk about nutrition as the most important element, at least in Mexico. And they talked about a circle of poverty that starts with poor nutrition in early childhood. I'm not sure that the concept of the way we understand it today exists back then, But you said poor maternal nutrition, poor nutrition in the child, poor development, circle of poverty because of less opportunities. Now, it seems to me that, and I guess it is really a question, is nutrition as a key toxic element for development in the US or in Europe a problem that's solved? It remains, and then the other question, does it remain a main problem for Mexico, for Latin America, or is it a relevant topic in the US? That's also a question.
We have 3- and 4-year-olds coming into Children's Hospital Los Angeles with type 2 diabetes. 3 or 4-year-olds.
Overnutrition, the problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
sure.
that answers your
Okay.
that answers your question. Is that I would say, from a developmental biology perspective, you know, preventing prematurity, preventing premature birth, and having high quality nutrition pre and postnatally solves a lot of problems. Doesn't solve all problems, but it solves a lot of problems. And we know this from like decades of research. It's not like it's new. This has been going on, and we know about we know about the Barker hypothesis, where there, you know, like prenatal exposure to different kinds of nutrients basically sets your ability to regulate food intake, et cetera, the kinds of food, you know, for life, right? So we know all this. And so why is it getting worse? It's literally getting, in the United States, obesity is, you know, it's out of control, right? It's an epidemic for sure. When you have 3-year-olds coming into a pediatric practice and they have type 2 diabetes, that's a lifetime for them of, as you know, and what's the system that gets affected the most? The cardiovascular system, right? So the gap is what we know and what we do. We have not translated this in a way that has penetrated, you know, that would make a difference. It's for me, it's egregious and a failure on the part of research to translate this in a way that actually makes policy changes.
I want to go to the other end of the continuum with this question as well, which has to do with the prevalence of hunger in the US as an abiding issue. So nutrition notwithstanding, one of the things that we consistently see in households with young children in the US is very high rates of food insecurity or hunger. During the pandemic, we followed nationally a large sample of families with young children, and we found that at various times, upwards of 40% of households just across the entire country said that they didn't have enough food to eat on a regular basis, that adults were skipping meals or doing other things because there wasn't adequate amount of nutrition. And in some subgroups, in Black and Latino populations, we found that the rates were at times as high as 60%. Wow. So we think of the US as a country where there's an abundance of food.
There is.
But that doesn't mean it's getting to everybody.
It's poorly distributed.
It's poorly distributed.
Correct.
We saw also during the pandemic that, and this was through more qualitative information, that many families knew where, especially very poor families, knew where they could get food because there was food assistance available. But the places that it was located in their communities, they couldn't get to, either because they had to go to and from work, they had nobody to look after their children, or because they had to take public transportation and it would take them an hour or longer with their children to get there. So the other thing that we see is that the other adults in children's lives in the US, so people who take care of children, preschool teachers and family-based child care providers, their rates of hunger are even higher. And I point this out because I think the issues around hunger and around food also play out in terms of unpredictability. If you don't know when you're going to have enough food, if food is going to run out at some point, if you have to make these difficult decisions about the accessibility of caloric intake, these are additional stressors that play out perhaps at a social level in addition to maybe some of these metabolic issues.
So
that we see.
it remains, are there centers looking into that in the US? Are there groups of people that you know that are particularly interested in the impact of either overnutrition or inappropriate nutrition or just lack of sufficient nutrition in terms of the impact on brain development, resilience?
So the National Institutes of Health funded a $25 million initiative called the Southern California Latino Family Health Program. So the principal investigator, Michael Gorin, is at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. So he does think he's the center of the universe, by the way.
He's a doctor, right?
I'm there also.
A pediatrician?
But I'm not in nutrition. I'm good at consuming nutrition, but I'm not in nutrition. So this center is focused exactly on what you're talking about. In the Latino community, it includes San Diego State University, University of California, San Diego. It includes University of California, Irvine. It includes UCLA. It includes University of California, Santa Barbara. It includes Kaiser. So it's very Southern California focused, and it has a large data collection longitudinally. It has 3 different intervention studies that are going on in terms of improving nutrition in Latino populations in Southern California. And it takes a village, although this is a very large village. Southern California, I think San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles County, Santa Barbara County is about 25 or 30 million people, right? I think 75% of the state of California's population is in Southern California. And you can tell that because it takes an hour and a half to drive 12 miles, or to drive 24 kilometers, it takes an hour and a half or 2 hours. Anyway, that center is exactly what you're talking about, and it started in 2021 or 2022, doing the kind of work you're talking about, how to introduce nutrition as a concept for families, how to make wise choices, how to create opportunities for more availability, and why starting early is so important. High sugar and high fat content early in the first 2 or 3 years, it has dramatic impact on circuitry of the brain. It changes circuits in the region of the brain that controls appetite and food intake, the hypothalamus. It literally changes circuits by either high sugar intake or high fat intake. So it's not like, oh, it just affects the metabolism of the body. It does that, but it's literally changing the circuits that are controlling how much as an individual, you're going to ingest and the kind of food you're going to ingest.
Yeah, so I asked that question because of my interest historically, but now as we discussed, it became also promotional for tech because we have, just like we have the center now that we're initiating work, we a few years ago created the Institute for Obesity Research, which is a transdisciplinary institute just trying to answer questions. But I think there is a great opportunity of working together with these areas. It doesn't have to be a primary focus, but I think I have a red clock here, which are probably, I'm surprised that people still here. I think if I was in the audience, I probably would be standing up and moving around. So I think we're about to close, and I hope we have a break now after that. But before we go to the break, I'd like you maybe to close with one recommendation, right? So we are a small group of warriors trying to launch an effort that will be transformational, and we probably need good advice. And so you will help us over time, I'm sure, but if you have one piece of advice today, of many that we had through these last couple of hours, but let's close the conversation with one final comment that may be an advice to the group that's leading this effort here at Tec de Monterrey and FEMSA.
Let me go first, because you should close things out. I want to encourage everyone to think about what Dr. Levitt was saying about the processes, these core processes that we know promote healthy development, because, the reason that I think this is so important, especially in the very early stages, the relational context, the context of the infant and the significant adults in the child's life. Because the solutions that can make a transformational difference in society that can be based on that scientific knowledge cut across all of the different relationships that a child might have with mother, with father, with grandparents, with teacher. And the processes draw people together naturally. The same things that an infant finds reinforcing from touch, from nutrition, the adult also finds reinforcing. And so instead of thinking about the complexity as the only thing to relate to, embedded in the complexity is a kind of parsimony or simplicity around what we have to do that relies on all of these things that nature and evolution have kind of brought us to. And so I just think that using all of the complexity but distilling it into knowledge and approaches and policies that are simple and that cut across the early relational context is the best thing that you can do. You can think about the center as exploding in so many different directions, but if you have kind of a core center to the work that's based in what are the basic core processes that naturally occur and that we can support, that families can support, that communities can support, that policymakers and researchers can support, that's where we think the greatest transformation can occur.
Pat?
I have a mic on. So I'm going to think about this in a very center-centric way, right? Advice that I try to live by on a daily basis, and why I think it helps in terms of success, right? You're going to define what you feel is an indicator of success along the way. So my advice is to know what you don't know. If you know what you don't know, and you're highly motivated, which you all are, it means you're going to go out of your way to identify individuals who you can work with who know what you don't know, right? So I would say know what you don't know. And that will create the kind of chemistry that you're looking for. And my bet is that your heart rate variability will be perfect.
Very good.
That's it.
Mine is getting perfect because we're going to a break. But I will finish here. Before we finish, so I'd like to thank both of you for being here. Because they both come from California. It takes a long time. It's away from your work, from your family, and I appreciate that. But I also like to make a commitment so that we'll be here in 5 or 10 years, and we'll celebrate the success of having learned what we don't know and maybe having centered our attention in what's really core for everybody. Thank you, Pat and Phil.
Thank you.
Gracias, Pat, Phil y Guillermo, por compartir con nosotros su expertise y conocimiento. Tomaremos un breve receso, retomaremos las actividades a las 11:40. Muchas gracias.